Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. RJ stood frozen in the middle of the design office at Forrester Creations, the hum of sewing machines and distant chatter bleeding into nothingness as Dylan's words landed like a slap across his face, each sentence heavier than the last, until finally it all crystallized into one unforgivable truth. Ivy hadn't just crossed a line, she had threatened her, and the rage that ignited inside RJ was instant, volcanic, and uncontrollable, his hands curling into fists as his pulse roared in his ears. Because how dare Ivy weaponize fear, how dare she use secrets like knives and press them to someone's throat, and when RJ finally spoke his voice was low and shaking, the kind of dangerous calm that only exists right before a storm, asking Dylan to repeat it, needing to hear it again not because he doubted him but because he needed the reality to hurt enough to justify what he was about to do, and Dylan, pale and conflicted, confirmed it all, how Ivy had backed her into a corner. How she'd made it clear that if certain truths came out careers would be destroyed, reputations shattered, lives blown apart, and that was it, that was the moment RJ snapped, his chair scraping violently against the floor as he surged to his feet, eyes blazing, breath ragged, every protective instinct in him detonating at once, because Ivy didn't just manipulate situations, she terrorized people. And RJ wasn't about to let that slide, not now, not ever, so he stormed out of the office with purpose etched into every step, the corridors of the fashion house parting around him as if the building itself sensed what was coming, until he found Ivy in the main showroom, calmly reviewing sketches, composed, polished, utterly unprepared for the fury that was about to crash down on her, and when RJ's voice cut through the air it was sharp enough to silence the entire room, demanding to know what the hell she thought she was doing. Ivy turning slowly, eyebrows lifting in faint confusion. But the mask cracked instantly under the force of his glare, and RJ didn't wait for excuses, didn't allow her the luxury of denial, because Dylan's confession had ripped the blinders clean off, and now he saw her clearly, every calculated smile, every subtle threat, every moment she'd twisted power to get what she wanted, and when he shouted, "How dare you threaten her?" it echoed off the walls, raw and unfiltered, stopping conversations dead, drawing stares, but RJ didn't care who heard because this wasn't about optics, this was about justice, about fury, about protecting someone who never should have been put in that position. Ivy trying to regain control, insisting she was just doing what she had to do, that this was how the game was played, but those words only poured gasoline on the fire, because RJ exploded, accusing her of hiding behind ambition while poisoning everyone around her, calling out her manipulation, her cruelty, the way she used secrets like currency and fear like leverage, and for the first time Ivy looked shaken, her confidence faltering as RJ stepped closer, voice trembling with barely contained rage, telling her that threatening someone crossed a line you don't come back from, that no success, no legacy, no fashion empire was worth becoming that person, and when Ivy tried to turn it around, claiming she was protecting herself, RJ laughed bitterly, exposing the lie for what it was, reminding her that self-defense doesn't involve destroying innocent people, that survival doesn't require intimidation, and the tension in the room was unbearable, thick with secrets clawing to the surface, because everyone sensed this was bigger than a private argument, this was a reckoning. Dylan watching from a distance, guilt etched across his face, knowing his confession had set this all in motion, while RJ laid it all bare, warning Ivy that her threats would not stand, that the truth had a way of surfacing no matter how deeply it was buried, and that if she ever went after her again there would be consequences she couldn't design her way out of, and for a split second Ivy looked like she might fight back, might throw one last threat, but the fire in RJ's eyes stopped her cold, because this wasn't bluster, this was resolve, the kind that comes from love and loyalty and an unbreakable moral line, and as RJ finally stepped away, chest heaving, the silence he left behind was deafening, Ivy standing alone amid scattered sketches and shattered composure, exposed in a way she never had been before, while RJ walked out knowing the battle wasn't over, that secrets were still lurking in the shadows of Forrester Creations, but also knowing one thing with absolute certainty, no one threatens someone he cares about and walks away untouched, not in this world, not in this shop, not on his watch. RJ didn't stop walking until the cool night air hit his face outside the Forrester building, but even then the fire inside him refused to die, his thoughts spiraling, replaying every word Dylan had said, every flash of fear he'd imagined on her face when Ivy cornered her, and the more RJ thought about it the angrier he became, because threats weren't just words, they were weapons, and Ivy had wielded hers with surgical precision, knowing exactly where to cut, and as RJ leaned against the brick wall trying to steady his breathing, he realized this wasn't over, not even close, because confrontation was only the beginning when secrets were involved, especially secrets powerful enough to make someone like Ivy believe she was untouchable. And back inside the building the aftermath of RJ's outburst rippled through the shop like a shockwave, designers whispering, interns exchanging wide-eyed looks, the unspoken understanding settling in that something ugly had been dragged into the light. While Ivy stood motionless for a long moment, her pulse racing despite her efforts to remain composed, because for the first time in a long time someone had looked at her not with admiration or fear but with moral certainty, and that rattled her more than she wanted to admit. Yet Ivy was nothing if not strategic, and as the room slowly returned to its usual rhythm she gathered her sketches with hands steadier than she felt, already calculating damage control, already telling herself that RJ was emotional, impulsive, that his outrage would burn out, but even as she clung to that thought a flicker of doubt crept in, because RJ wasn't just angry, he was righteous, and righteous anger had a way of unraveling carefully constructed lies. Meanwhile Dylan lingered near the design tables, the weight of what he'd done pressing heavily on his chest, because telling RJ the truth had felt necessary but terrifying, knowing Ivy's reach, knowing how quickly she retaliated, yet watching RJ stand up like that, watching him draw a line in the sand, sparked something Dylan hadn't felt in a long time, hope, and when RJ finally returned inside, calmer but no less determined, Dylan approached him cautiously, apologizing for dropping the bomb the way he did, but RJ shook his head, telling him the truth mattered more than timing, that silence only protected the wrong people. And those words echoed later that night as RJ sat alone replaying everything, realizing that Ivy's threat wasn't just about control, it was about fear. And fear thrived in darkness, which meant the only way forward was light, painful and blinding as it might be, and over the next few days that light began to seep into every corner of Forrester Creations, subtle at first, missed meetings, tense glances, Ivy's name spoken in quieter tones, until the tension became impossible to ignore, and Ivy felt it too, felt the shift in power even as she smiled through fittings and presentations, because whispers followed her now, and she didn't know who knew what, didn't know how far Dylan's confession had traveled, and paranoia became her constant companion, while RJ on the other hand grew more resolute, meeting with Dylan in hushed conversations, piecing together the full scope of Ivy's manipulation, discovering how long she'd been pulling strings, how many people she'd pressured into silence, and each revelation hardened his resolve, because this wasn't a single incident, it was a pattern, and patterns demanded accountability, yet RJ wasn't reckless. He knew charging in fists flying wouldn't dismantle Ivy's influence, so instead he watched, listened, waited, learning the game she'd mastered so he could dismantle it piece by piece, and when Ivy finally confronted him privately days later, her tone cool but edged with warning, accusing him of turning the office against her, RJ met her gaze without flinching, telling her she'd done that herself the moment she chose threats over integrity, and when she warned him again, more subtly. This time, about consequences, about reputations and careers, RJ felt something unexpected wash over him, calm, because fear no longer had power over him, not when he knew the truth, not when he knew he wasn't alone, and that calm unnerved Ivy more than his shouting ever had, because calm meant preparation, and as RJ walked away from that conversation he knew the storm was coming. Not just for Ivy but for the entire shop, because secrets never stayed buried at Forrester Creations, they exploded, reshaping alliances and exposing loyalties, and when the day finally came, when the truth surfaced in a way no one could ignore, it would trace back to this moment, to Dylan's confession, to RJ's furious "how dare you," to the line he'd drawn and refused to erase, and as the gears quietly turned behind the scenes, one thing became increasingly clear. Ivy had underestimated the power of someone who wasn't afraid to burn bridges to protect what was right, and in a world built on image and ambition, that kind of conviction was far more dangerous than any threat she'd ever made. The fallout didn't arrive all at once but crept in like a slow poison, saturating every conversation, every glance, every creative meeting inside the B&B shop until it felt as though the walls themselves were listening, and RJ sensed at the moment he stepped back onto the design floor the morning after his confrontation with Ivy, Because people looked at him differently now, not with shock anymore, but with expectation, as if something had been set in motion and they were waiting to see whether he would follow through or retreat into silence like so many before him, and RJ had no intention of retreating, not when the image of her shaken voice from Dylan's story still burned behind his eyes, not when he could still hear Ivy's calculated calm trying to justify intimidation as strategy, and that memory fueled him as he moved through the shop with purpose, quietly checking in on the people Ivy had brushed up against, asking questions that seemed harmless on the surface but carried weight underneath, questions about deadlines, about pressure, about moments when they'd felt cornered, and at first most deflected, too conditioned to protect themselves to risk honesty, but RJ was patient, offering something Ivy never had, safety, and little by little the cracks widened. A designer admitting she'd been strongly encouraged to change credit on a piece, and in turn confessing she'd been warned that speaking up would end badly, and with every revelation RJ felt the scope of Ivy's reach expand, realizing this wasn't just about one threat but a culture of fear she'd cultivated to keep herself untouchable, and the realization made his anger colder, sharper, because this wasn't impulsive cruelty, it was deliberate. Meanwhile Ivy felt the ground shifting beneath her even as she doubled down on control, tightening schedules, asserting authority louder than before, mistaking fear for loyalty. But it wasn't working anymore, because once fear was named it lost its invisibility, and people began comparing notes, exchanging stories in hushed tones, connecting dots they'd once been too afraid to acknowledge, and Ivy noticed the subtle resistance, the delayed responses, the lack of enthusiasm, the way meetings went quiet when she entered, not loud rebellion but something far more dangerous, withdrawal, and it unnerved her because she couldn't threaten what was already slipping from her grasp. And Dylan watched it all unfold with a mixture of guilt and relief, knowing his confession had sparked this unraveling but also knowing it was long overdue, and one evening as the shop emptied out and city lights spilled through the windows, Dylan and RJ stood among half-finished designs, talking not about Ivy but about responsibility, about how easy it was to stay quiet when power loomed overhead, about how speaking up always felt like jumping without a net, and RJ admitted that part of him was terrified, not of Ivy but of what the truth might cost everyone once it fully surfaced, yet even as he said it he knew there was no other option, because protecting someone meant more than yelling in a showroom, it meant staying when things got messy, and messy arrived sooner than expected when Ivy finally made her move, not with another direct threat but with a carefully orchestrated narrative, pulling in higher-ups, planting doubts about RJ's professionalism, suggesting his emotions were clouding his judgment, framing his actions as disruptive rather than protective, and for a brief moment it worked, because institutions favored stability over truth, but Ivy underestimated one thing, evidence, and RJ had been collecting it quietly, messages, timelines, corroborating accounts, not out of revenge but necessity, and when the meeting finally happened, when Ivy sat composed at the table presenting herself as the victim of a smear campaign, RJ felt his pulse steady instead of spike, because this wasn't a showdown fueled by rage anymore, this was reckoning fueled by facts, and as he spoke, calmly, clearly, laying out patterns instead of accusations, naming behaviors instead of emotions, the room shifted, because it's hard to argue with consistency when it's mapped out in black and white, and Ivy felt it then, the first true crack in her armor, as her carefully curated story began to buckle under the weight of collective truth, people she'd counted on avoiding eye contact, others nodding slowly as recognition dawned, and for the first time Ivy looked truly alone, not cornered by one furious man but surrounded by the consequences of her own choices, and the silence that followed RJ's final statement was heavy, not explosive, but decisive, because this wasn't soap opera chaos anymore, this was accountability, and as the meeting adjourned with promises of review and investigation, Ivy walked out stiff-backed but shaken, knowing damage control could only go so far when the narrative was no longer hers to control, and RJ exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks, knowing this was only another step, not the end, but a meaningful one, and later that night, standing once again outside the building where his rage had first spilled over, RJ reflected on how fury had transformed into resolve, how dare you had become more than an outburst, it had become a boundary, a declaration that threats would no longer be normalized. And inside the shop the atmosphere began to change, subtle but real, conversations a little freer, shoulders a little less tense, creativity flowing without the undercurrent of fear, and Ivy, watching from the margins now, realized too late that power built on intimidation was fragile, that the moment someone refused to be afraid the entire structure wobbled, and though she would fight, would scheme, would attempt to reclaim control, the spell had been broken, because RJ had done the one thing she never anticipated. He hadn't backed down, he hadn't been silenced, and he hadn't been alone, and in a world obsessed with image, that truth was louder than any threat, echoing through the B&B shop long after the shouting stopped, reshaping alliances, exposing shadows, and proving that sometimes the most dangerous force isn't ambition or secrets or fear, but the moment someone looks you dead in the eye and says enough, and means it. The investigation didn't pause the tension. Inside the B&B shop, it sharpened it, turning every day into a waiting game where smiles were tight, conversations clipped, and everyone seemed hyper-aware that something irreversible was unfolding, and RJ felt the weight of that awareness with every step he took through the building, because now it wasn't just anger driving him, it was responsibility, the knowledge that by speaking up he'd cracked open a truth that couldn't be shoved back into the dark, and that truth was messy, complicated, and dangerous for everyone involved, especially for the people Ivy had intimidated into silence for so long. And as days bled into weeks, the formal review became the quiet axis around which everything revolved, interviews scheduled discreetly, emails marked confidential, doors closed more often than usual, and Ivy played her part flawlessly in public, composed and gracious, reminding everyone of her contributions, her loyalty, her vision, but beneath that polish she was unraveling, because she could feel control slipping through her fingers like silk, and the more she tried to grasp it the more obvious her desperation became, snapping at assistants, rewriting narratives mid-sentence, contradicting herself in small but telling ways, and RJ noticed all of it, not with satisfaction but with grim clarity, because this was what happened when fear stopped working, it turned inward, and still there were moments when doubt crept in, moments late at night when RJ wondered if he'd gone too far. If he'd underestimated the blast radius of truth, but every time that doubt surfaced he remembered Dylan's voice, the way it had shaken when he admitted what Ivy had done, and he remembered the fear he'd seen mirrored in others' eyes once they realized they weren't alone, and that memory anchored him, because this wasn't about ego or winning, it was about making sure no one else was ever forced into silence by a threat disguised as ambition, and Dylan, for his part, stood by him through it all. Even when the pressure mounted, even when subtle warnings started circulating, anonymous reminders of how fragile careers could be, and those warnings only proved how necessary this fight was, because intimidation didn't disappear overnight, it fought back, but this time it wasn't one person standing alone against it, it was a growing collective, quiet but resolute, people choosing honesty over safety in small, brave increments, and the turning point came not with a dramatic confession but with accumulation, testimony stacking on testimony until denial became impossible, and the day Ivy was called into a final closed-door meeting the air in the shop felt electric, like the moment before a storm breaks. And RJ tried not to speculate, tried not to hope for a specific outcome, because he'd learned that justice rarely arrived cleanly or loudly, but when Ivy emerged hours later, pale and rigid, eyes blazing with something that wasn't anger anymore but loss, everyone knew the truth had finally landed. And the announcement that followed was carefully worded, corporate and restrained, but unmistakable. Changes would be made, authority restructured, behavior addressed, and Ivy's power was officially curtailed, not erased but diminished, stripped of the unchecked leverage she'd wielded for so long, and the shop exhaled collectively, relief mingling with shock, because even partial accountability felt monumental in a place where image had always outweighed impact, and Ivy avoided RJ after that. Not because she'd forgiven him or accepted responsibility but because she couldn't bear the mirror he represented, the reminder that her downfall hadn't come from an enemy but from someone who refused to be afraid, and RJ felt no triumph in that avoidance, only a sober understanding that consequences didn't always look like villains being dragged away, sometimes they looked like influence fading, like doors closing quietly, like power no longer being absolute. And as weeks passed the culture inside the shop began to shift in tangible ways, meetings growing more collaborative, credit given more freely, voices once hesitant now speaking with cautious confidence, and RJ watched it all with a mixture of pride and humility, because he knew change was fragile, easily reversed if vigilance slipped, And one evening as he and Dylan sat among finished designs ready for presentation, the weight of everything they'd survived settled in, and Dylan admitted he hadn't realized how heavy the fear had been until it lifted, how normalized it had felt to shrink himself to survive, and RJ nodded, understanding that too well, because rage had been the spark but solidarity had been the fuel, and when RJ thought back to the moment he'd shouted "How dare you!"